Reading 79 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 2, Quaramid Uglé, June 9th, 1945. Work on negative emotions. A man cannot advance a single step in his own development unless he begins to observe and contend with evil emotions. All evil emotions, that is, all negative emotions, are useless. Each of them has its own poison. At the bottom of all these emotions lie violence and self-worship. The emotional center, which should conduct the influences of the work to us almost continually, save for brief periods which we have to endure, cannot do this if it is dominated by evil emotions. If the emotional center gives nothing save negative states, if it continually feeds us with different combinations of these negative states, it stands in the way of any possible growth of being, of which we might otherwise be capable. It is a good thing to try to make lists of negative emotions for yourselves. In these lists, you must include various states of depression, various kinds of self-pity, various kinds of persisting resentment, of feeling badly treated, and you must also include many kinds of hatred, many unpleasant forms of self-satisfaction and contempt of others. And especially must you include the feeling of meritoriousness, one of the most unclean of all the emotions, and one which perhaps shuts out all influences from higher centers more than any other emotion. The purification of the emotional center is especially emphasized in this work. I remind you here that while it is useful to make a list of negative emotions, both from what one has observed in other people and what one has observed in oneself, the one thing that can tell us when we ourselves are negative is that faculty that the work calls inner taste. We can think of this as the beginning of real conscience. For a long time, people enjoy their negative states, enjoy the taste of them. It may take many years before a person begins to dislike being negative, even slightly. He or she then begins to taste them, to know the taste of them, and so to recognize them by this inner organ of taste, which is not turned towards outer life, but towards one's inner world. Some negative emotions are very malicious. They have a very strong taste. It is as well to begin to recognize them and tear them away from any overlying, self-justifying, and to see what they really are. The emotional life of a man and a woman is completely destroyed by the presence of these many forms of negative emotion. How can you expect people who from early childhood upwards have imitated and absorbed every kind of negative emotion ever to come together? The extraordinary thing is that people sometimes have marvelous pictures of themselves in this respect. They imagine they are amiable and tolerant, easy to get on with, kind and forgiving, and all the rest of it. What they do not see is that underneath all these things lie a great many negative emotions, a great deal of inner talking, not only in themselves but also in the person with whom they think they get on so well. I fancy this accounts for many strange looks on people's faces sometimes. In other words, such people think they can do and ascribe the merit of it to themselves. No, we must face ourselves much more sincerely than that and not leave our emotional life in darkness. Negative states arise mechanically, provoked directly or indirectly by some outer circumstance, by something said or not, or by some quite trivial incident. Mr. Ouspensky once said two things about negative emotions that struck me very much at that time. He said that in face of great crisis, people are not negative as a rule. It is only the small things of life that call forth negative states. The other thing that he said was that what irritates us in other people is usually their mechanicalness. At least he mentioned this as one source of negative states. He said that we forget that people are machines and constantly do and say the same things and behave in the same way and express the same thoughts, but that above all we do not realize that we ourselves are machines and that our reaction of irritation is just as mechanical as the thing in the other person that called it forth. To see another person as a machine is not enough. In fact, it is very dangerous because then one only sees one side of the matter. One has to realize one's own mechanicalness. What does it mean to realize one's own mechanicalness? It means long and continual effort of work on oneself and the constant increasing of work memory, that is, the special memory that begins to be formed in us through uncritical self-observation, one might almost say impersonal observation of oneself by oneself. Then one has real moments of realization of one's own mechanicalness, of what kind of machine one is. These flashes in which one realizes one's mechanicalness directly and not in theory, these moments in which one sees for a fact that one has behaved in that way many times before, are actually moments of self-remembering. Something is detached from the machine and is outside the machine, and it is exactly this being outside the machine for a moment that gives the feeling of self-remembering, and that indeed gives a slight taste of real I, for the self that one should remember, if one could, is not a machine. Perhaps we should not bring in the idea of real I here because we are speaking in two great terms. We should perhaps merely think it is a moment of full observation, and that we are conscious in observing I, which is looking at the machine with which we are usually completely identified. But yet, as you all know, observing I, which is formed by the work and its ideas, is the beginning of that vertical path that leads through deputy steward to steward, and through steward to real I, or master. Now, to return to negative emotions. Negative emotions are of course mechanical. They are part of our machine, as it is, what is sometimes called our dirty machine. The task is to clean this dirty machine, and the dirtiest part of this machine is the negative part of the emotional center, which we have acquired by imitation, and with which we were not born essentially. As Mr. Ouspensky pointed out, if we were born with the negative part of the emotional center, we should have no chance of separating from it. If it were part of our inherent psychological machinery, we could not strip ourselves away from it. Negative emotions are acquired and are quite useless, whereas all that we are created with is useful. That is the point of which one must constantly remind oneself. They are worse than useless because they absorb and drain away so much of our ordinary force. All the finest transformations of the three foods, ordinary food, air, and impressions, are continually being interrupted and destroyed or wrongly formed by the action of the negative part of the emotional center. Try to see for yourself by direct observation how a negative state drains force from you, and try to see what happens when, having observed your condition, you genuinely try to separate from this state for your own private reasons and not for the sake of being congratulated or to gain merit. If you do this rightly, you will feel a shock. You will experience the sensation that you have suddenly escaped from something evil, something that you did not realize was evil. Then you will begin to understand why it is said that we can detect the presence of negative states by means of inner taste. One can indeed see the negative state that one has escaped from literally, lying beneath one at a lower level at such times. Now, here would be a good place to speak about negative states in illness. A person with very well-developed negative states that have never been observed and so never contended with will be inclined to have his or her general powers of resistance to illness diminished. That is one point. The next point is that a negative emotion, or let us say the energy connected with its manifestations, may link up with the illness and increase it. In short, it may make the illness worse or more persisting. You may suffer from something that should be merely temporary, some form of illness, some form of pain, and so on. But if it comes on a negative background that has never been faced with any courage, the condition may persist or become exaggerated. From another point of view, making bad chemistry in us. Such states are, so to speak, toxic, beginning in the psychological sphere and working down to the grosser sphere of the physical matters of the body. You know how in this work psychological matters or energies, called hydrogens, pass by increasing condensations into the grosser matters of the body. Now remember another point. Every psychological event, whether it be a sensation or a feeling or a thought, consumes a certain amount of energy if it is identified with, whereas if you are in a state of self-remembering, energy will be created and conserved for further use. Do you all know what it means to look back at a state with which you were identified and see it as something quite small and unimportant, and wonder how you could have consumed so much energy mechanically over it? All energy that is mechanically used is consumed. That is why it is so important to begin to think about what it means to live more consciously, for in this work we all seek to live more consciously, both within ourselves in relation to all that is going on within us, and also outwardly in our relationship to others and to life in general. Of what use is it to speak of this work as having to do with inner transformation, with what Mr. Ouspensky calls psychotransformism, if we do everything mechanically? That is, if it does everything mechanically, the machine in us. This is not living more consciously. It is just being what you are as a machine. It is simply a machine doing everything. Since negative emotions are the greatest wasters of energy and have so many other destructive effects upon us, it is of the greatest importance to try to prevent force from continually going into them. This will always happen if we identify with our negative states. That is why it is so important to try to separate from a negative state, not to go with it, not to consent to it, with the mind at least. For if both the mind and the emotions consent, then there is full identification and a full influx of energy into the negative state. That is why we must try to starve our negative states, because the more we nourish them, secretly approve of them, and secretly enjoy them, the more energy they will insist on taking from us. A person who is a slave to his or her negative emotions is actually a slave, only the trouble is that we very easily enjoy different forms of slavery, not recognizing that we are really in prison. But it is useless to speak of all this if you do not yet know what it is to observe negative states and negative remarks in yourselves. So I tell you to observe how you talk. Some can only talk negatively. Now, what negative state or talk have you observed in yourself today, each one of you? If you are at a loss to find an answer, I can only say that you are not working. You are doing no work on yourself, which is the starting point of this work. If that is the case, then ask yourself, why am I doing no work on myself? Then I ask you this question: have you observed yourself criticizing someone else today in a negative way? Probably you will say, yes, you have. Then again I say to you that you are not working on yourself. Why are you noticing how other people behave without noticing yourself? That is behaving in a most mechanical way, in which everyone behaves in life. But we are in the work. We are doing something extra to what is necessary in life. We are learning something that we do not learn from life and which is not necessary in life. I find it difficult to imagine that anyone who has heard this work for some years can pass a whole day without observing some negative state in himself or herself, and without making some work effort to separate from this state, either by non-identifying with it or by what I call neutralizing it, through seeing the same thing in oneself as one saw in the other person. Now, we spoke last time about work on being, and spoke about being complacent about one's state of being, that is, being satisfied with oneself as one is. I advise you to read that paper again and reflect on it. Now, with our being as it is, at our level of being, we have negative emotions. Our level of being is characterized first of all by multiplicity of being, by many eyes, that is, by lack of unity. It is characterized by a state of sleep. It is characterized by the absence of self-remembering. It is characterized by the presence of great numbers of negative emotions which are, so to speak, continually drowning us. A higher level of being cannot be reached if our negative emotions remain as they are and continue to exert the same power over us as they do. This is quite clear. This can be understood. Therefore, study your negative states, for this is one of the most important sides of self-study. Observe them, note them down, and above all, remember them so that when they come back again, as they always do, you may gradually recognize them before they can exert their full power, namely, before you can identify with them. Especially in the morning, clear your mind of negative, unpleasant, and criticizing states before you pass, so to speak, into external life. And at night, go through your negative states and try to see them in retrospect. And if you do this genuinely, if you have come to the point of recognizing your negative condition and desiring to begin to get free from it, then you may rest assured that you will receive help from eyes in you that wish to work, and they are capable, possibly, of passing on to a higher level of being. But do not let the work get cold for too long. 8 hours sleep is quite enough. But if you sleep psychologically for a whole week, you will be in a bad way and will have to start everything all over again.